1.5 kV DC. In the north, we've got 20 kilovolt 50 hertz system. In the south and on the north end of Honshu and on Kyushu, you've got the same 20 kV and 60 hertz. And I think my photo is blocking it here, but for some reason, the tunnel linking Honshu and Hokkaido is a 25 kV 60 hertz line. Taiwan's electrification is much simpler. It's simply 25 kV 60 hertz. There is still some freight service, and it's mainly in the heavy density corridor where there's both heavy freight and passenger service. Unlike in the US, where you don't see much freight, where you see high-speed lines, if you stay with the 3-foot 6-inch lines, you'll probably see freight during your visit. Right now, about 30% of the domestic rail traffic in Japan, passenger traffic, is by rail or rail transit. It's a smaller market than it was, share of the market than it was in the 50s, but it is still very impressive when compared to other countries. Rail trips per person are probably higher in Japan than any other country in the world. Passenger kilometers per person are probably second only to Switzerland. Both rail passenger trips and passenger rail kilometers have been growing slowly over the last 10 years, despite a slight loss in population. Post-COVID, rail traffic is off, but not nearly as much as in the US. I was unable to find mode share for Taiwan, but the high-speed line carried almost 20 times the number of passengers that the Acela did. But what do you expect when you travel about the distance between Boston and New York in an hour and 45 minutes with 70 trips a day in each direction and an on-time percentage of 99.3%? The freight market in Japan has declined noticeably since 2008 overall. Tonnage shipped in the country dropped by 8% to 2018, and ton miles by 25%. Rail tons dropped in proportion to the market, but the ton miles did not drop as much as overall freight ton miles. Still, rail share is small, partly due to the competition from cargo ships. A type of competition, because of the Jones Act, is quite limited in the US. Again, in Taiwan, I was unable to find modal share data, but it appears that rail share is even smaller in Taiwan than it is in Japan. Only 7.3 million metric tons of rail freight was carried in 2019. Do we have any questions, David, this time? You're muted.
I've screwed up plenty of stuff tonight. We have one question from George Bulow. He asks, when JR was broken up, there were two brothers who each bought a major part and were fierce personal rivals. They were both billionaires, among the richest men in Japan. He doesn't remember their family name. Can you talk about them and their enterprise? Do you know anything?
No, I know that I have owned a few shares of JR East, but I don't know that story. Again, I'm not an expert on Japan.
Okay. Don't see any other questions. So if anybody has any questions, type them into the Q&A real quick. Otherwise, Andrew is going to move on.
Okay. There's lots of interesting things to go and see in Japan. And I would recommend not just sticking to the large cities, because the rural country is quite interesting. I mean, you have the largest, the most used railroad station in the world. Tokyo's Shinjuku Station handles an estimated 1.2 million passengers per day. And so you can find really impressive stuff in the big cities, but I still would recommend that you look elsewhere around the country. We'll go into a little more detail on 4 of these very interesting sites that you might see. The first is the Shinkansen Tunnel, the world's longest tunnel with a portion underseas. Note that I chose my words deliberately. The undersea portion of the tunnel linking the UK and France is longer, but the overall length of the tunnel is shorter. This tunnel is also the deepest below sea level, and until 2016 was the longest mainline tunnel in the world. The Goddard Base Tunnel in Switzerland, which opened that year, eclipsed the Shinkansen Tunnel in length. Serious planning for the tunnel began in 1954 when a typhoon sunk 4 ferries, killing almost 1,500 people. The largest of these ferries was the Toyo Maru. The tunnel opened in 1968. It was built to dimensions to handle standard gauge Shinkansens, but the Shinkansen service to Hokkaido was not begun until 2016. The only passenger service through the tunnel now is the standard gauge Shinkansen service, but freight trains still use the 3-foot 6-inch gauge track. There are 2 emergency exit stations within the tunnel. Prior to the start of the Shinkansen service, there were museums about the tunnel and an amusement park in the stations. As a matter of fact, on the publicity photo that was sitting behind David now, that was one of the locomotives that took trains to the amusement park within the tunnel. Another fantastic piece of engineering is the Great Seto Bridge. This fascinating structure shown in an aerial view here is actually a series of bridges over 8 miles in length, linking Honshu with the southern island of Shikoku. Individual spans are quite impressive. 2 of the suspension bridges are among the longest suspension bridges in, are among the 20 longest suspension bridges in the world. A double track rail line occupies the lower deck, and the highway is above the rail line. Suspension bridges that carry railroads are rare, and cable-stayed bridges are even rarer. Construction took over 10 years, and the bridges opened to both rail and highway traffic in 1988. The Amaru Viaduct, does it look a little bit familiar? It was built by the same company that built the Mugna Viaduct on the Metro North Fort Jervis line. Located on the north coast of Honshu, it was the site of tragedy in 1986 when a train that was deadheading was blown off the bridge by high winds. The conductor and 5 people on the ground were killed. The steel structure was replaced by the concrete structure shown in this photo in 2010. 3 of the original vertical support girders were preserved and renovated and have been turned into a promenade. And you can walk this promenade and get close up to the trains passing by. A little bit old, the Shinkansen Tunnel opened in 1931 when a direct line was opened by between Tokyo and Niigata. This is a single track spiral tunnel. All trains used that spiral tunnel until the line was double tracked in 1967. if you want a photo like this one at a station just outside the tunnel, make sure you're riding a southbound train. The corresponding station for the northbound trains is in the new tunnel that was built when the line was double tracked. And if you get off at that station, you have to climb 462 steps to exit. No elevator, no escalator. And that 462 steps, the Bunker Hill Monument only has 292. Not only are there individual railway sites which are interesting, but there are many railway museums. The preservation effort is well advanced. In the Tokyo area, there are no less than 3 major museums. JR East sponsors the Railway Museum. The private Tobu Railway has a second one, and the Tokyo Metro Museum celebrates the city's subways and L's. Each JR company has its own museum, and there are many more throughout the nation. In 1977, on my 1977 trip, I thought that the Yumekoji Steam Engine Museum was world class. They had a sample of most modern Japanese steam, of each class of the most modern Japanese steam locomotives in the roundhouse, and they pulled one out every day, even though the weekday that I visited, there were very few visitors around. This museum has probably at least double in size when the Osaka Transportation Museum was consolidated with this one, new building north of the roundhouse when these photos were taken in 1977. It's easy to find operating steam in Japan, or it can just surprise you. On my 2002 trip, I kept seeing posters of a steam locomotive in operation as I traveled north. When I got to my hotel in Sapporo, I did quite a bit more research and discovered there was a steam excursion out of Sapporo the next day. So I arranged a very early wake-up call to get to the station when the ticket office opened. And I was able to get an excursion ticket. And this was really a great excursion. At a servicing stop, passengers were allowed into the cab. The equipment wooden coaches was immaculately maintained. The first class lounge had a piano and appropriately dressed period costumes for some of the people who ran the excursion. I will now stop my screen share and turn it over to Alex. Alex enjoys bento box meals, has lived in Taiwan, and he's another person for whom railways are both a profession and an avocation. Alex, say all right.
And let me just comment that Alex is going to be, you're not going to see his face because he doesn't have a video camera. So he will be narrating, but you won't get to see him, regretfully.
Site, all right. Mass Bay presentation section 2, okay to go. So first of all, were there any questions on the previous section? Perhaps we could address any of the questions before we start the second half.
I don't have any open questions, Alex, so you have a high green to proceed.
All right, well, In America, commuter, regional, and intercity trains are operated by different companies. In East Asia, there are different classes of service run by the same company, typically with dedicated equipment. It is important to experience each train type. Named trains have the most luxurious service, like beverage carts, reclining seats, and curtains. On the endearing local trains, you can feel the hospitality of down-to-earth country folks and understand a slice of their life. The East Japan Railway runs the former JNR network north and east of Tokyo, except for Hokkaido, and many of the Tokyo commuter lines. They are internationally well known and the first JR company to go to IPO. On the left is the Akagi Tokyu, and is both an intercity train and a long-distance commuter train, kind of like the Amtrak Downeaster. The local train on the right is in the Shonan livery, which is traditional to JNR. The inset is a Kiha, a diesel multiple unit used on branch lines. The Central Japan Railway Company, or JR Tokai, runs commuter trains around Nagoya and intercity services in the heavily industrialized Tokaido belt. The Wideview Shinano is an intercity express on the curvaceous Chuo line. If you pay the extra fare for the first class green car, you can sit behind the driver and see the beautiful mountain scenery. It is like the Acela Express, except that tilting trains are everywhere in Japan. The West Japan Railway Company runs the commuter network around Osaka and the former JNR network down to the bottom of Honshu. The unit on the left is a Sandabado Thunderbird, part of the Hitachi A-Train family, which also runs in Taiwan, Korea, Thailand, and in the UK. Around Osaka, you might just see some very, very old trains, like the 103 series EMUs built in 1963. Shikoku is a relatively less industrialized and populous part of Japan. The JR company there remains publicly owned. It is a good place to experience the more traditional Japanese culture. Nonetheless, the tilting trains have made their way here, running on mostly single-track older infrastructure. The Anpanman train, painted for the comic book hero, runs in Shikoku and across the Great Seto Bridge. It is always fun to find them passing in a passing siding. Kyushu Railway Company is the last one to be privatized in 2016 and derives 60% of its revenues from non-railway operations. It is a highly diversified business with hotels, fish, mushroom farming, and a bakery chain. You can discover Japan's industrial past in northern Kyushu. There are many excursion trains and much rural diesel trackage, including abandoned and never completed lines in majestic vistas. The JR Kyushu employee pictured is pointing at and calling out all the safety features as part of pre-departure checks. Before we leave the JR companies, are there any questions from the audience on this segment?
I've got a couple of questions that came in just as you started, Alex. Doug Kidd asked, he says he was impressed by his visit to the Osaka Transportation Museum in 1998. Do I correctly understand that it is closed or consolidated with another museum? Can you fill me in on this?
Yes.
I see Andrew wants to answer that.
Yeah, both the Tokyo Transportation and the Osaka Transportation Museum were consolidated with the JR company's own museums at that time. And they've built new buildings and made them destinations to get to. I think it was about 2006 that the consolidation was done, but you can look it up. The internet will be more precise than that on it. And yes, they still are places that you want to go and visit, with not only rail transportation exhibits there.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And the second question we have is from John Crotsley. Wants to know, are there special trains in Hokkaido to pay attention to?
There is a variety, such a variety that, and you do have some very scenic coastal runs. I have not ridden enough to give precise recommendations, but I don't think it matters once you get off the main line, which direction you take out of Sapporo. There's interesting stuff in all directions.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't see any other questions. So Alex, why don't you forge ahead?
All right, so before we move on, I think Alan McMillan had a question about the Uzui Pass. I typed an answer. I don't know if you see it. So basically, the line is 3'6" gauge, which is the standard gauge out on the island. Today, it is a walking path with all the former railway tunnels intact and lighted. So what happened was, it was originally a cog railway when it was first built. And then it was electrified and then converted to a double pusher district. So, you know, even EMUs that were going through that area required 2 electric locomotives to essentially push them up the grade. This service was abandoned when the parallel Shinkansen was opened. But there is a museum at the Yokogawa end of the terminus of that third sector railway, which is now basically a branch line to a small station, and you could see the cog locomotives and the old pushers and some Tokyu cars out there at that Yokogawa Railway Museum. And then let's go back to the question about special trains in Hokkaido. So right at the very tip of Honshu, right before you enter Hokkaido, the station is called Amaru. That's the sort of like where the ferry would have docked on Honshu in order to go to Hokkaido back in the old days. And there is a branch line that heads off to the east, which I don't remember the name of right now, but their claim to fame is that they still have coal-fired stoves in wooden passenger cars that were kept in operating condition. So I think it maybe runs once a week or something like that. But they do have that in regular service. So at least they did, like, you know, 5 or 6 years ago. So that's something to look up. A wooden stove car is like a huge thing, you know, because I guess it's not electric. So it's kind of a throwback to the past. All right, so seeing no further questions, I'm going to get back on script and continue the next section. This is worth a mention because it confuses many people. In the major metropolitan areas, you can use contactless cards like Suica to pay your train fares. It is a good deal, but be careful not to get on the express trains or occupy a reserved seat because you need to pay extra for those. You can buy an excess ticket for the express portion of the fare. The Japan Rail Pass is a good idea because it gets you out of having to figure this out. In Taiwan, you have to buy the correct ticket for the class of train you're traveling on. But there's also a Taiwan Rail Pass that you could use if you didn't want to figure it out. Shinano Railway is a third sector railway in Nagano Prefecture. It runs a major portion of the former Shin-Etsu main line. Japan Rail Pass is nominally no good here, but the fares are low, And you can see that public transport really is a way of life here, with students riding the train to get to their middle and high schools. The open window brings in the fresh mountain air. The Eshiko Takimiki Railway is an example of a third sector Shinkansen feeder line. The Hokuriku Shinkansen replaced this segment of the Shinetsu mainline in 2014. This is a one-man operation, complete with an LED panel displaying fares to all destinations. Passengers without tickets can deposit exact change in that fare box. Here, the train is making a station stop in the siding on the level gradient before reversing direction and rejoining the main line uphill on the right. The non-JR private railways often have the least standard and thus most interesting rolling stock. Kintetu, based in Osaka, provides an alternative rail system for travel between Nagoya, Kyoto, and Osaka. Many private railways also have through running arrangements with each other, so you can see a variety of rolling stock. The non-JR railways are reminiscent of the American interurban electric railways, but more modern and much busier. Wakayama Electric is another private railway serving the mostly rural Wakayama Prefecture, Japan's center of orange production. They run Toku cars built in 1972, but have been refurbished to give each car distinct personality. The Strawberry Den was created to highlight the strawberry farms near Kishi. The Tama Den was decorated to commemorate Tama, a Calico Cat super station master at Kishi Station. The Red Omo Den features vending machines selling souvenir toys. Although these marketing efforts led to a 20% gain in ridership, maintenance of infrastructure remains a long-term challenge. The line operates at a maximum speed of 37 miles per hour. Kishi Station has been completely remodeled into a cafe where you can visit with Tama II, the incumbent station master. Calico cats are considered good luck in Japanese culture. On sale are many cat-themed items, including the hot cat, a frankfurter sausage made with fish, and a full range of souvenirs and books. You can also try out the uniforms for railway drivers and guards. All this talk of cafes has made me hungry. Before we leave the private railways and go visit the dining car, are there any questions from the audience on this segment?
Let's see. Tom Chase asked, with a locomotive on that steam excursion, the same one used in the TV soap opera Shujuren, which was set at the station in Hokkaido. Tom Chase says he was a faithful viewer during his time in Japan. Andrew, you may need to take that one.
I'm not sure. The JR Hokkaido has preserved multiple steam locomotives. And I'm not familiar with the TV show.
Okay. And Phil Mulligan asks, does that line out of Amaru also have steam locomotives?
I don't think so, but one would have to go to what's current. It's the last time I was there was almost 20 years ago.
Okay, and we had a comment in the chat from Kenneth Lynn. He says the railway which operates the stove train during the winter season is the Tsugaru Railway. And that's what we've got right now.
All right, so Back to the dining car. So do you think this picture shows an ekiben? No. Unfortunately, dining cars on regular trains have not operated for many years. This traditional Japanese curry tonkatsu, a panko-crusted pork cutlet, is actually a display at the Omiya Railway Museum. Many restaurants in Japan make plastic food replica and display them in their windows. You can still find such nostalgia on board Japanese ferries. At one point, J&R operated many ferries that connected railway systems on different islands. The food has not changed. You can really travel back in time and experience a slower pace of life. But this is not an ekiben. You cannot simply pick it up and keep moving in a New York minute. So it really isn't convenient for today's professionals. Is this an ekiben? An ekiben is a single portion takeout meal served in a lunchbox sold on trains and in stations. Traditional bentos contains rice or noodles with fish or meat, often with pickled and cooked vegetables. Yes, this is actually a classic ekiben. The Hokuriku Express train made a lunch stop at Yokokawa, a helper base where pusher locomotives were attached to push EMUs up Uzui Pass's 6.67 gradient. These terracotta bowls traveled with the passengers and the train and were collected and sent back by railway staff. You can still find it today, even though the train is abolished. Is this an ekiben? Technically, yes, but they are for tourists and little rail fans. Kids like many train-themed things, and this is a treat for younger visitors. This ekiben is from Okayama, the capital of peach production in Japan. Each station has its distinctive ekiben, which can only be purchased there and features locally sourced foods. This adds to the allure of train travel. Momotaro is the peach boy from the traditional Japanese folktale. He was born from a giant peach, which was found floating down a river by an old childless couple. A statue of Momotaro is outside of Wakayama Station. This is the ekiben counter at Shinosaka Station. It even says famous ekiben. Ekiben is prepared fresh by industrial kitchens off-site and delivered to ekibeneries. When it's sold out, it's gone. This is an ekiben kiosk in Fukuoka's Hakata Station. Fukuoka is known for its ramen and not its ekiben, but out-of-town salarymen still need somewhere to eat. You can always tell from the white shirt and the black trousers. Ekibento developed in Japan during Taiwan's Japanese period. The concept was imported to Taiwan along with railway operating practices. Fulong Station is also a traditional lunch stop. The Japanese-era ekiben format was kept there. Taiwan Railway Administration developed the ekiben into a major product line, and employees joke about the TRA being Taiwan Bento Administration that has a side business running trains. In reality, ekiben accounts for only 5% of total revenue, although a full 21% of its revenues come from non-rail businesses. Third parties do sell bento boxes in Taiwan, but only TRA official bentos are sold on board trains. That's all on the ekibens. Are there any questions from the foodies amongst us?
We have no questions regarding food, although people tend to jump in with questions after we moved on. We have a couple other questions we'll save for the end.
All right, moving on. There are practically no locomotive-hauled scheduled passenger trains in Japan anymore. and in Taiwan, they're disappearing fast. Many Japanese rail fans travel to Taiwan in search of reminiscence of JNR operations from the late Showa era. The 1957 Nippon Chariot non-air-conditioned blue coaching stock, fabricated in Japan, purchased by Taiwan with American Reconstruction Grant, is hauled by American EMD locomotive. General MacArthur's legacy lives on even after 63 years. The Taiwan Chariot and the Daewoo electric multiple units are the backbone of Taiwan's local train fleet. The Daewoo is the predecessor to SEPTA's Rotem cars. The inset shows diesel multiple unit made by Toku Car, the mainstay of non-electrified express trains. TRA recently completed electrification of 100% of its mainline network, so the future of these DMUs are uncertain. These cars feature shot welding technology licensed from Bud. And of course, some employees are also rail fans. Whatever you find in Japan, you can probably also find in Taiwan. Many railway museums, ekibens, cliffs, tunnels, a roundhouse, and even the last working major forest railway anywhere within the former Empire of the Sun. It's all here. Shifen Station is famous for having a station that is the village main street. Hexing Station has a resident cat. Jingtong has an old coal classification yard that's now a cafe. Cultural exchange between Japan and Taiwan remains strong today. The Yutang Ping broken viaduct was built in 1906 and designed by American civil engineer Theodore Cooper, famous for the Cooper rating in structures. This is the original brick and steel structure. It was destroyed in 1935 by an earthquake. And then the adjacent replacement, perhaps much less interesting, was built in 1938. The railway at this location was entirely bypassed with new double-track tunnels in 1998, making it a good place to hike. In 1999, one of the 4 remaining piers fell down after another earthquake. But there are still 3 left, so go get them while you can. Just as in Japan, rail freight in Taiwan is also in decline from heavy short sea shipping and truck competition. Photo shows a unit aggregates train being marshaled and an engineer special train with a diesel electric and a diesel hydraulic locomotive working in multiple. The diesel hydraulic was made by Niigata Tekko of Japan and has a Cummins diesel engine. If you're into tunnels, Taiwan and Japan are great places to visit because you can generally look out of the front or back end of the train and get a good view. There are still many rock-lined tunnels, and many are immediately preceded by viaducts. Terrain here is very tough for passenger railways. One of TRA's non-rail businesses is train-borne advertisement, but done in a strategic way that makes the train itself far more than just a moving billboard. The Hello Kitty Taroko train showcases EVA Air's destinations throughout the world, with cars featuring Hello Kitty visiting the famous Japanese landmarks, Hello Kitty going on an African safari, and here's Hello Kitty shopping in New York City. EVA Air had Boeing 777 aircrafts painted to match these liveries. There are also many Hello Kitty trains in Japan. Unfortunately, this train set, TEMU 1014 and 1013, was involved in the worst accident since 1948 on Taiwan's railways. This was a right-of-way incursion where a contractor boom truck tumbled down an embankment and was struck by the express Taroko Tokyu at 75 mph 1 minute later. The Tokyu then struck the tunnel portal 2 seconds later. There were 49 fatalities and 245 injuries, due mostly to the national holiday period, which led to standing room only conditions on this train. Both the engineer and his assistant lost their lives. For the first time in its history, the TRA operated a special funeral train, taking the engineer's ashes from the accident site first to his crew base to sign off duty, then to his hometown for burial. A 3-day national mourning period was declared, and the affected line was reopened 18 days later. It is hard to describe how the whole Taiwanese society rallied to support the victims and to emotionally process the accident. In America, we might have empathy for school shooting victims or fallen firefighters in a "I am Spartacus" kind of way. In Taiwan, because everyone uses the train for one reason or another, there was a real sense of, today, I am a railroader, solidarity. This comic strip is from a popular freelance writer, Gunyang Zhuang Rushan. She does not have a particular interest in railway topics, but nevertheless depicted the accident sequence and the involved vehicles very accurately, down to the correct 4-car EMU half set, showing us that the Taroko in the sky understood the hero's send-off that we gave to them, acknowledged our salute, and showed us their smile as they are diverted by the tunnel to an unexpected destination. This, my friends, is the essence of our railway culture. The railways are not a special interest group. There is a part of the railway in every Japanese and Taiwanese person. Here are some of the resources we used in researching this presentation. Thanks to Google Translate, you could discover all this yourself when planning a trip, even if you don't speak our language. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to show you all the maps, but you can Google Map or Wikimapia all the places we talked about. We hope to whet your appetite for our rail network. There is truly something for everyone, even if you're only using the railway as a means of conveyance. Railway enthusiasm is not a fringe activity in East Asia the way it is here. Railway travel is a way of life for many, and knowledge of the network is the passport to fun experiences, and thus a respected and desirable characteristic. In America, they say that truckers know all the best places to eat. In East Asia, you could say that railroaders know all the best places to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Andrew. We've got a couple more questions that came up on the Q&A earlier, so I'll just read those. Lance asks, turning briefly to Japan's high-speed trains, what are the average speeds, and in US dollars, what would be a representative fare for a 400-kilometer, 250-mile express train?
Hey, this is a railway presentation. We don't talk about airplanes here.
He was asking about speeds of trains.
One thing is for sure, for non-Japanese citizens, the Japanese Rail Pass is the best way to go, far cheaper than buying individual tickets. You'll find that, like Europe, transportation prices are significantly higher than they are in the US because the entities are expected to support them. I mean, it's been 20 years since I've been there, so I'm not current on prices, but they will be quite high by comparison to the US.
Okay, thank you. Tom Engel asks, is the Showa era is Emperor Hirohito's reign? Is that correct?
I'd have to look that up on Wikipedia to answer that question. You want me to do that now?
The spirit moves you.
Showa era is prior to the 1980s.
Okay. So that's definitely extended beyond Hirohito. Alex, is there any steam running on Taiwan? Tom Chase wants to know.
So in Hualien, which is on the East Coast, there is a steam working group. There is one steam locomotive that's good for mainline running, I think by the number of CT261. It's up for like some boiler repairs, like I guess in America it'll be like a Class F exam or something. So we don't know for how much longer it'll keep running. There are other steam locomotives that used to be operable, but I think recently CT261 is the only one that remains active. Now, this doesn't mean they won't necessarily go back and fix some of the locomotives and put them in service again, because there's like sort of a renaissance in this stuff, even recently, much more so than there was even just 20 years ago. So, I mean, if I had to guess, I would think that they will keep something running, because it will be part of, you know, the whole railway culture thing. But as to which one they choose to keep running and for how much longer they could possibly keep doing it, that's a different question entirely.
Yeah, it's interesting that there haven't been more of those locomotives preserved, given what you told us about the centrality of railroads to the cultural experience of most Taiwanese and Japanese citizens.
So what I can say about Taiwan is that Taiwan was not a free country before 1980. So there was a lot of paranoia around railway equipment. So prior to 1980, the preservation movement was virtually non-existent. The central government controlled all of the assets, and the reason some of these assets survived was because they got hidden in the back of shops where the government officials couldn't find them. So that's the story with Taiwan. I think with Japan, there's significantly more stuff that's operable. But even just recently, the Kaya Railway Museum had to close. And the reason they had to close, this is a railway museum in Japan, it's because there was succession planning problems. Essentially, they had some steam locomotives, but mostly first generation DMUs, you know, first generation Kihas. And the folks that were capable of maintaining the diesel engines and the transmissions on these first generation Kihas were retired personnel, and they were basically beginning to age out. And it's practically impossible to train these folks from scratch. So because of that, you know, Japan had to close down one of their railway museums specializing in DMUs. So this active preservation stuff is not easy. And most of it is relating to the skill of the personnel who are required to maintain this equipment.
Okay, thank you. Tom Engel notes that Hirohito died around 1986 or 1988. And Alan McMillan asks, I guess this would be for Andrew, does that railroad roundhouse filled with steam locomotives in Japan still exist? Do you know?
Yes, it does. That's the key display at the Kyoto. Now it's now called the Kyoto Railway Museum, and that is the location where the Osaka Transportation Museum moved next door to.
Ah, okay. There you go, Alan. Better buy your ticket. Okay, if anybody has any other questions you'd like to have answered in the official program, so to speak, type them in now. And then we're going to basically wrap up the meeting and stop the live stream and the recording. And we will invite those of you who are attending, if you want to stick around and ask questions in person, you'll be able to do that. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. So Alex, I think we can stop your screen share now. And gallery view here. So I want to thank Andrew and Alex for a quite different presentation than some we've had. Certainly a very different type of railway operation in many respects. Very interesting program. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we'll thank you all for watching. And if you want to watch it again, most of it will be on YouTube. Unfortunately, I kind of screwed up the YouTube live stream, so it didn't kick in till about 18 minutes in. And but all the good pictures are there anyway. So at this point, thanks a lot. If you're watching on Facebook, thanks for joining us, and log into the Zoom webinar if you want to continue the discussion. So if you do want to join the discussion, you know, please press raise your hand, and we'll get you into the meeting as quickly as we can.